Good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody got up and looks bright and cheerful this morning. I want to apologize. You don't have my paper on your little IFPRI USB drive handed out, but because I was late with my paper, I had, among other things, a house full of guests last weekend in my house, and things just got complicated. However, it's going to be available on the website. It's work in progress, so it's marked draft, and I hope you'll observe it. The paper I'm circulating is actually about Uganda, so it's some work we did on Uganda that looks at poverty reduction, spatial inequality, and the labor market, and the links between the three, and why they matter for poverty reduction. I'm going to present today some slides from several other countries as well, because we're doing work, that kind of work, on a number of countries, and my work recently has been focusing also a lot on non-farm enterprises in rural and urban areas, so I'm going to present some of that work as well. Okay, so before I start, whenever I start, I have to make sure that we're all on board in terms of the same definition of informality. I personally hate to use the word, but we'll start out with it and then go on. So just to be clear, there is informal employment and there are informal enterprises. The two are very different. I'm not going to talk about informal employment, so versus formal employment. That's what Alan was just referring to in Mozambique. I'm not going to discuss that. What I'm going to discuss is basically mostly about this section here, and the development of this section here, and why. Basically, not this part, but the rest of it, the rest of this part is quite important for structural transformation. Okay, so this is basically the points that I'm going to try to convince you of, and really that I want to show some different ways of looking at structural transformation at the micro level on what they matter in terms of analyzing an economy and the labor market, employment, and poverty reduction. Okay, so I have this slide in here just because the paper I'm circulating is about Uganda and spatial inequality. So just for some of you who are unfamiliar with Uganda, Uganda's had a lot of poverty reduction, but it's been uneven across the different regions, and so that has exacerbated spatial inequality. There are a number of reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the conflict in the north, but part of it also has to do with the development of household livelihoods and economic opportunities. Okay, wow, that didn't show up, did it? On my computer, this one looks like Derek's circles, so I'm not really sure what happened here. But let's see, somehow the colors seem to have changed. I'm going to skip this. Oh, there they are. I love it. I just keep pressing buttons and they come back. I don't understand technology. Okay, so these are Derek's three circles of structural transformation, output transformation, rural-urban transformation. That's what Alan just talked about. Now, when he put this circle up, it was called occupational transformation. I changed it to livelihood transformation, and there's a reason for that, and so I'm going to explain why. Okay, so now this picture, I think everybody in this room must know this picture very well. Didn't it come from Peter Timmer? I forgot even where it came from, about how the timing of the transitions vary, and that the decline in agriculture, the output transition in terms of agriculture as a share of GDP happens faster than you would generally see a labor market transition occur. So now, here is some data on Uganda. So now we look at this data and we say, okay, wow, it looks like the output transition is moving right along. Isn't this good? We're really making progress. We see industry growing. We see services growing. This looks like a nice, balanced economy. Great, great. What's going on? Terrific. Wonderful. Okay, so then we have, here come my arrows. We have the question of whether employment is following. Now, just to look at these are the labor force numbers, right? Now, if you looked at actually the official labor force numbers that came out of UBOS, you'd actually see no change. You'd actually see this one at about 84% or something of the labor force. That's because Uganda has never measured the labor force with the same survey every time. So what happens is they keep adding people into the labor force, and so therefore they keep getting a higher share of the labor force in agriculture instead of a lower share of the labor force. So that's partly what Danny and Maggie are up against when they do their cross-country work. I adjusted these numbers. I corrected for this increase in picking up of the labor force. So I managed to get a decline in the labor force in agriculture, but not much compared to what happened in output. And we also see, so the labor force doesn't decline as much as we see in output, and we see a fairly slow growth of the labor force in industry despite a very rapid growth of GDP. So is there something wrong? What's going on? Is there no structural transformation in employment in Uganda? That was based on the official numbers, the conclusion of the government about 2 or 3 years ago. There was no structural transformation. Well, the first thing I think it's important to look at is if you don't focus on sector, but if you focus on employment type, you do start to see structural transformation. If you look at the people who say their primary employment is self-employment in farming or family worker in farming, this is growing much slower than the labor force. And if you look at the rest of the areas, except for public wage employment, you see they're growing faster than the rate of growth of the labor force. So when we look at employment type and not sector, we do start to see a structural transformation occurring. And I think that especially important is the growth of private wage workers. Now, this shows the whole picture from 1992 to 2005-06, but in the data of just the decade of the aughts, the private sector wage worker non-agricultural employment was actually growing at over 10% per annum, which is pretty good. Now, so here you have for 3 countries, you have the same story. So again, for Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, you see that in all 3 countries, this number, I'm sorry, it's wrong. I just got this number from my research assistant last night. That number's wrong. I'll give you a correction. But you see, for all these countries, you're getting a growth of private sector wage and salary employment, okay? And yet you have, he switched these 2. I realize that's what happened. Didn't he? Yeah, I think he switched these 2 because look. Okay, so in all these countries, you're getting a growth of private sector wage and salary employment that's pretty good, but it's not enough to absorb the growing labor force, okay? But we're not seeing a large growth in the family farming employment. What we're seeing is a large growth in the home-based enterprise. And this is what people say is their primary employment, okay? So that's really, so that's my point is that that's the transformation that's occurring. And what you see then is that in Uganda, this transformation tends to go hand in hand with other areas of growth in the economy. So in Kampala and the central region, where the growth of consumption was the fastest and the poverty reduction is the fastest, we have the lowest share of people that say that their primary employment is agriculture. And we have the highest share of people that are showing non-agricultural employment. Okay, so that's my first point about how to look at the transition, is that if you just look at sectors, you're going to miss it. Look at types of employment. The next way to look at the transition is, as many of you know, really what happens is households have a portfolio of economic activities. So first of all, people tend to have multiple jobs. So if you ask the question right, somewhere between 40 and 50% of people that you survey will tell you that they have at least 2 economic activities. Maybe they have wage work in agriculture, maybe they have agriculture in a non-farm business, but they have at least 2 economic activities. And most households have at least 2 sources of income. So the second kind of economic transition I think we need to look at is the economic transition that of household livelihoods. Okay, so here's an example of looking at the importance of non-farm enterprises in household livelihoods, which you can see are important in both rural and urban areas. Now, this is, I'm going to break this down by rural and urban in a minute, so you don't have to go dizzy looking at this graph. But this is something we did for Uganda, where we're trying to look at how this portfolio changed. So what you're going to see in the portfolio is basically that in the, well, let's break it down here. So here you can see that in the rural areas, the people that only depended on farming income, the number of people that only depended on farming income fell. So there was a major transition in that this shrunk and the rest of these increased. Okay, and what especially increased is the circle that's family farm and household enterprise, and family farm, household enterprise, and wages. Now, in the urban areas, what you see is that they actually shed agriculture. Okay, so this purple triangle up there, and the ones near the purple triangle that were agriculture, that was shed. So this is another example of a transition that's happening in Uganda, which you would miss if you just look at the standard statistics, if you look at individual employment, and if you just look at sectors. Okay, so now why is this transition important? This transition important, well, this data is actually from Mozambique, but I've got similar data for other countries. It's just I had this one. I was working with this one last week, so I put it in. It looked the nicest. But what this one shows you you have a log scale down here, is basically that, of course, median earnings are lowest in agriculture, in about the middle in household enterprises, and highest in wages. So if households add one of these 2 sources of income, they usually add to total monetary welfare. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about adding a source of income. Who can add a source of income? Well, there are a number of reasons, there are a number of things that are important, very important in terms of the institutional environment, the policy environment, the local economic environment that allows households to add enterprises and keep those enterprises running successfully. I'm not going to go through all of that now. That's a separate, whole separate presentation that's part of our study. We discuss it a little bit in our paper, but what I really want to stress here is the importance of education. And what's happening is that this sector, the household enterprise sector, or the rural non-farm sector, is primarily absorbing the people with complete primary education. So this one's from Tanzania. I have the same thing for Uganda, and I have the same thing for Ghana. So the people with complete secondary education are going into wage and salary. The people without complete primary education generally are not successful and do not stay in this sector. There's obviously a selectivity going on as well, because access to education was not so even many years ago, but education seems to be very important. Now, this, of course, relates to the question of whether there's an under or over migration. If people don't have much education, how are they going to move to urban areas and take on this job? Okay, so now here's my, my last point. If you were looking for a structural transformation in the next 10, 15 years, with everybody moving out of the agricultural sector into another sector, it won't be in wage and salary employment. So I did this slide for the Ugandan Minister of Finance about a year ago when he wanted to hear something about youth unemployment. But it worked out so well, I keep it in all my presentations. So what this slide is saying is that we simply did a simple elasticity growth. So we took the very high growth of private sector wage and salary employment that Uganda was having, and we trended it out based on simply an elasticity of over 1 in terms of the growth of the non-agricultural sector. And in Uganda, we had the non-agricultural sector growing at about 10% per annum. But of course, the labor force is growing very rapidly. It's growing at about 3.3% per annum. So what this said is that even if you do as well as we could possibly hope, this is the transition that you can hope to have in your labor market, okay? So you could hope to move a lot of people, maybe even a fifth of your labor force, into wage and salary employment by 2020, if just everything goes really well. But don't forget, and you could expect to get this down to nearly 50% if everything goes really well. But the way that this is going to get down to nearly 50% is going to be through here. This is going to be important, but it's going to be through here. So I think that's the part of the structural transformation that sometimes we're not discussing in our development strategies. Sometimes in our development strategies, we have an idea. I sometimes say that countries can move from the farmer, from the farming economy to the post-industrial economy in one leap. And my answer is no, that's not going to happen, and that this is quite important. And what happens when you see this happening, when you look at your national accounts, you're going to see that average productivity in industry and services is actually going to fall. Why? Because these people have a lower productivity. They have less capital to work with, among other things, and less education. And so then you say, oh my God, this is a disaster. Productivity in industry and services are falling. It's not a disaster because you've got people moving from this very, very low productivity sector to this one. Okay, so this is here's the summary of my story. Basically, the structural transformation appears first in output, but it's only going to reach households through changes in livelihoods. And those changes in livelihoods are going to happen within the household economy and within the decision-making structure of the household. So the household is going to decide to allocate some of its labor and some of its capital away from agriculture into the non-agricultural sector. That this structural transformation is often hidden in official data, and that this structural transformation is usually not supported because it's viewed negatively. I mean, it's the informal sector. This has to be bad, right? But that actually, and that it actually can even sometimes appear as a widening of inequality. But it's actually a good transformation. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation.